Next, I would like to introduce Sebastian Heinzmann.
Thank you very much. I'm here today to talk a little bit about the inclusion of older adults in clinical trials. We know that we're actually not as good, potentially, as we should be. But who am I, apart from the person standing between you and the coffee break? I've been working for Roche for the past 8 years, and I work in medical affairs, so not in ClinOps and not in R&D, really. But this topic is close to my heart because I work in lung cancer, and a lot of lung cancer trials actually don't include the population that we're actually trying to solve for. What I'm trying to do today is maybe give you a little bit of an idea of to what extent our trials are actually representative of the population we're trying to serve. Give you a little bit of background around why it's actually quite a complex topic, including older adults in oncology trials, and perhaps give you a little bit of an idea of what we're doing in Roche, and maybe give you a little bit food for thought in terms of what you could potentially take away. Diversity often focuses on race and ethnicity at the moment, which is important. But as we've heard earlier, it's also important that you consider age, that you consider socioeconomic background. And as Anne-Marie said, it's really important that it's not just a numbers game and that you tick the box, but it's important that the people that you include in your trial are actually representative of the people that you're trying to treat later on. The questions are older adults really underrepresented in clinical trials? And when you look at the data, you'll see that when comparing epidemiological databases such as SEER in the US, and then you look at the patients in a trial, that there's generally a discrepancy of around 6 to 8 years in terms of the median age. It's not the whole story though, because what that doesn't take into account is the fact that the trial setting, for example. So if you've got a registrational trial, or you've got a signal-seeking trial where you know very little about the drug, it's obviously very, very certain that you're not going to include older comorbid patients because you don't know the side effect profile, and therefore it might not be ethical. It also doesn't take into account that observational trials, they should probably be more representative. As I mentioned, the life cycle, it's really important that, if a drug's been on the market for 10 years, you should be more representative. You know the side effect profile, whereas if you've got a new drug, you want to be as careful as possible. What's also not taken into account is that in the real world, there's also actually a large population, especially, for example, in lung cancer, of patients that don't want any treatment. They're like, well, I've smoked for 40 years, I'm 80 years old, I don't want any treatment. And then also, that's also happening in lung cancer, and I've got a little working group where we're actually trying to solve for why older adults are maybe not represented in clinical trials. And what we found out is that 70% of patients over the age of 75 don't receive a standard dose regimen in lung cancer, which means that the physicians modify mostly the chemotherapy dose, but there's actually no evidence whatsoever that this is actually suitable. So it's really interesting that it's a little bit like the Wild West when you actually dig into real world data. So the question is, or the thing is, you don't actually just want to solve for older patients. You don't want to just have African Americans. You don't just want to have a certain group. You want them to be representative. And for age, that means that you actually want to solve for patients that are a bit more on the frail side, a real world population. And oftentimes with age, they're characterized by comorbidities and polypharmacy. And one of the questions is, well, do you want to include those in pivotal trials, or should there potentially be separate trials? Because hopefully most of us will reach an age where you will also have comorbid conditions, and you want to have treatment that's actually tried and tested in the population that you're trying to serve. So what are the issues with including older patients? So older patients have different physiological parameters, and that's why it matters to create data in those patients. So when you get older, you get muscle wastage, you may have different metabolism, you have impaired kidney functions, not necessarily comorbidities, but they're just things that come with age. On top of that, comorbidities like heart disease, diabetes, liver impairment, that is generally just things that are more common in older patients. And to treat those, a lot of patients will receive a whole variety of medication. And that basically can cause drug-drug interactions, it can cause compliance issues, it can have an impact on physicians prescribing something that's actually a side effect of another medication, so it's like medication cascades. Another thing to take into account is that for older patients, the endpoints that we look at in a lot of clinical trials may be different. So if you think maybe you're 80 years old, do you want a treatment that gives you 5 more years with a lot of side effects, or do you maybe want 1 or 2 years with really high quality of life? And that also means you need to look at the side effect profile, because if you've got sort of certain geriatric syndromes, like you're more prone to falling, a younger patient may not have issues with a medication that makes you dizzy. An older patient that can suffer from a fall that will incapacitate you, that's a lot more important. So actually looking at different parameters makes sense for older patients. And then it can be things like formulation and dosing. If you're arthritic and you've got tiny little pills and you've got bad eyesight, or if you've got an injection pen that is really difficult to operate when you're older, those things really matter. So the bottom line is, why does it matter to look also at older patients? Among all the different groups that we should be looking at, is that older patients may just have a different benefit risk profile, and especially in diseases that are characterized by being more common in older patients, lung cancer, prostate cancer, it makes sense to actually look at those patients. So they are underrepresented in our clinical trials, but why? It's not just that we don't want to include them, or there are definitely things such as the inclusion-exclusion criteria that prevent them, but there are also things such as not being able to tolerate a standard dose. And as I've mentioned, in lung cancer, almost 70% don't receive the standard dose, and it's not tried. Nobody's actually looked at whether that has similar outcomes compared to what's approved. Then there may be limited social support. So that means transportation to the hospital. Maybe something that you can solve, in ClinOps, providing a taxi, but that's not everything, because maybe the person needs somebody to explain the forms to them, that walks them to where the blood draw is compared to where the scan is, navigating all those complexities, which is not as easy sometimes when you're old. And then you may have maybe a little bit of cognitive impairment. It may just be a little bit too much for you, because you might also be a little bit more set in your ways, which means the willingness to participate may also be different. If you tell somebody, well, you have to come in 3 times a week, as opposed to 1 time a week if you're not on a trial, then they go, well, Tuesdays I see my grandchildren, Wednesdays I've got bridge. So it's just different priorities as well, on top of things such as socioeconomic factors. And then there is also investigator bias, meaning, as a physician, you look at a patient and you go like, they're not suitable for a clinical trial. I'm not even sure I can give them anything that's really tried and tested. So an example, you've got a typical lung cancer patient here, 78 years. Martha, she's got stage 4 lung cancer. She smoked 40 pack years. That's the equivalent of 1 pack a day for 40 years. So heavy smoker. She's also obese. She's got issues with her thyroid, diabetes, and she gets a whole barrage of medication to treat that. In a trial, for example, if you think about early stage for pharmacokinetics, that's a nightmare when you think about the drug-drug interactions. Also, in terms of all the comorbid conditions in a clinical trial, you may just look at the patient and go like, as a physician, definitely not trial material. Not even sure I can give them anything really worthwhile. Changing the picture of Martha now, maybe you've already been biased by the picture I showed you. If I now say that she's actually a really lovely, bright woman. She smoked because she was coping with the stress of being a single mum, raising 3 children and running her own small business. And she used it as a crutch. She tried to stop, but she just couldn't. But she packed it in 20 years ago when she sort of retired. And she wants to maximize her time to be there for her grandchildren. So maybe all of a sudden your attitude changes. That's one of the things that experience as well. For example, when it comes to trial inclusion, sometimes patients just don't get asked. So what are the barriers for pharma to including older patients? So number 1, it's the lack of potentially comprehensive safety data, meaning you just don't want to risk that the patient has an adverse event. You may just, if you talk to your commercial colleagues especially, you want to de-risk a trial. You don't want to increase risk or heterogeneity. Then there are technical and logistical challenges, which means you don't want to do anything that may jeopardize your regulatory PTS, your chance of success, your clinical chance of success. You also don't want to be the person, by including a population that's more at risk, of having results that make you look less competitive versus other companies. Because, we focus on return on investment. We need to, because trials are expensive and you need to recoup the cost of your trial. So safety concerns can prevent the inclusion of older adults for pharma. You just don't really want to risk a patient's well-being. So it's really of an ethical nature if you don't know very much about the drug. Then, on top of that, you've got the technical and logistical barriers. What does that mean? It means, as I said, 70%, for example, of lung cancer patients get a regimen that's not approved, as in it's not the standard dose. So if you try and do a trial with that and try to submit that to EMA or FDA, they're probably going to have an issue with that. And even if they don't, probably the likes of GBA or HAS or NICE may have an issue with that. On top of that, it's a really heterogeneous group. When you think about the number of comorbidities somebody can have, the medication that they take, the permutations of, the heterogeneity, stats colleagues are also going to go, oh, that's really, really not helpful. And then you may also use pre-established endpoints. As I said, overall survival, that's the gold standard in oncology at least. But for older patients, it may actually be, the safety profile, it may be the adverse events, it may be quality of life. But you need to have certain tools in a trial simply for regulatory purposes. You could, for example, introduce something that's called a comprehensive geriatric assessment that tries to sort of give a baseline of how frail a patient is. But it's just another test, another questionnaire, another assessment on top of, as we know, already a whole heap of things that we ask patients to do. So it means it may be another burdensome protocol element that you want to actually not really do. And then the competitive pressures, and that's, I think, quite important, because you have a heterogeneous population. You also have a competing risk, death, which means that some patients, based on their comorbidities, based on their age, may just die from other causes compared to the disease, which introduces additional cost, it increases uncertainty. And then also, depending on the health of the older patient, there may not necessarily be a uniform standard of care, such as, for example, guidelines around dosing, and it may differ between countries in terms of what you're supposed to do. And then, on top of that, there is the value that is put on medians and milestones. So we're trying to resolve these barriers step by step, but I think pivotal trials are a little bit tricky, and potentially separate trials are the way forward. But the issue is, in drug development, you want to de-risk, but you also want to, you need to recoup the money that you spend. And here, it's the same drug versus standard of care looked at in two different populations. You've got population A, it's a healthier population. You've got population B. The hazard ratio expresses the reduction of risk for the patients dying. In both populations, you've got a 33% reduction in death. So in both populations, the drug works equally well. But one has got a 4.5-month difference and the other 2.5. Same drugs, just different populations. I can tell you that marketing colleagues much prefer population A because it looks a lot nicer on the marketing brochure. And why? It's not because we're just greedy, because it works. Because when physicians look at it and when you see that, they think, well, that drug looks a lot better. And so if you do your study in population A, in population B, and your competitor in population A, it's not good if you don't have a level playing field. So I've listed a whole lot of problems and difficulties, but there are certainly things we can do. And in Roche, for example, we've got a group called AIR, which is Advancing Inclusive Research. And what we're trying to do is at every single step of research and development, implement guidelines, implement incentives that make you think about populations. So not only older adults, all populations that are really, basically representation. So for example, protocol templates that from the get-go include more relaxed inclusion-exclusion criteria, and you have to justify why you tighten it, not the other way around. And we have internal standard SOPs, we have guidance documents from early research and development to regulatory, literally across the board, that incentivize and that encourage people to think about representation. There's also FDA diversity action plans, but God knows what those will look like. Actually, today is the day, 26th of June, when the FDA theoretically should publish their final guidance on diversity action plans, but nobody knows what that will actually look like. What we also have is interactions with society. So for example, we heard about READY. We interact a lot with the International Society for Geriatric Oncology, and then different work streams at ESMO and ASCO and a variety of different societies. We also have dedicated studies and tools to try and really achieve representation in our trials. I think the key to more data in older adults is, willingness, because where there's a will, there's a way, and a level playing field. Because, when you think back about the population A, population B, EMA has got like a pediatric investigation plan. You could imagine something similar in geriatric populations, because if there is no competitive disadvantage to doing so, and everybody has to do it, then you're more likely to do it. At the same time, if something like that were to happen, it needs to be done by consulting all stakeholders, because the trial, the regulatory environment is already complex as it is, and you don't want to actually make trials more risky, more costly, and have the opposite effect of what you're trying to achieve. So I think in your organization, wherever you work, whatever department, I think having a mandate to think, not necessarily you have to implement it, but at least think about representation. Make sure you have things that, around biological sex, race, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic background. If you have incentives to at least think about how you could change your protocol, your informed consent, the tools that you use to adapt for that, then I think that's already a good step. And then also, and that's something that we did with one of the trials that we ran and actually got approval for, is try and look for commercial value. Because oftentimes like, it's risky in a separate trial, but oftentimes when you actually look for value, you can find it. And I think if it's cost neutral, if you at least recoup all the costs that you spend, I think from an ethical perspective, it makes sense to do it. And then, as we heard from Thierry, for example, there's lots of tools that we can use, like organoid models, model-informed drug development. There's lots of innovative things, including AI, that you can implement to at least model certain characteristics to maybe find how drugs behave in older populations, and at least give physicians a little bit more information around how they can better treat those patients. So in conclusion, I think registrational trials will remain skewed until there is a bit of a more level playing field and there is an incentive to include those patients. And therefore, separate studies are probably best suited at the moment. But I think, I would try and encourage everybody to use novel and innovative approaches to create data that at least facilitates the use of drugs and gives physicians more tools to tailor their treatment. And then, of course, there's things such as really in ClinOps as well, to try and address barriers to recruitment and minimize patient burden. So I hope that you think about not only older adults, even though that's a topic of my talk, but generally representation in clinical trials, because I think it's very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sebastian. I really liked how you provided a spectrum of opportunities to tackle this issue. We have time for one question for the audience. Tom in the back.
That was a great presentation, first of all, of the complexity of the problem, but also, as you say, offering some solutions. When you think about the continuum of clinical evidence from clinical trials through to other evidence forms, one of the things that sort of struck me about your presentation was that it seemed to be that the sponsor was going to have a lot of accountability for filling the evidence gaps. And I just wondered what your thoughts are on whether or not there should be a more collective approach to addressing some of those outstanding evidence challenges.
Most definitely. I think it's a general problem, I think not only for age, but you could generate a lot of data, like real-world data to look into, but then you've got all those issues about disparate databases, different standards, contracts. I think if regulators or the EU would have an incentive to pool data to create pan-national registries and things like that, I think real-world data provides a very powerful tool to at least see how patients are managed, which then could give ammunition to drug manufacturers to say, well, this is how patients are actually treated in the real world. And if you allow us to do studies with XYZ regimen or dosing, then you could be one step closer, because it's always a problem including those patients in an ITT, because you can't usually justify taking certain populations out of an ITT in a clinical trial. And as I mentioned, competitive pressures and everything, I think it is important to create this level playing field, and that is across the board. It's clinical trials, it's observational studies, everything. So yes, I think it is very important, and the onus should not just be on the pharmaceutical companies.